I'd like to start off by thanking the Wits School of Governance for hosting this forum. I think forums such as these are very necessary, and I hope that this will be the first amongst many. Because I think the topic that we're tackling today is one that is not easily exhausted in the space of an afternoon. I think the problem that we sit with this is that many of our analyses, much of our public discourse, lacks both generality and specificity at the same time. It lacks generality in that often we launch into these debates without pausing to think where we come from and from what background we are addressing these problems. The reality is that we are a new democracy, 20 years after liberation, dealing with the consequences of 3 centuries of colonialism and 50 years of apartheid. Systems that wreaked systematic havoc on the vast majority of South Africans. Now, nowhere in the world are you going to deal with the consequences of such a system in less than a generation. You can make a lot of progress, as we have as a society, but you're not going to deal with those problems in that space of time. And I think if we don't appreciate that we're discussing these problems against that backdrop of persisting levels of poverty, of inequality and unemployment, and I think very fundamental for this discussion, that we're not dealing with these issues in the context of the need for massive social transformation of our society. I think we are missing the point. The reality is that 20 years into democracy, I think in many instances we have barely started to scratch the surface when it comes to spatial transformation. It's proved to be one of the most difficult and enduring aspects of apartheid. The point has been made often, including in documents by government, by Copter in particular, that much of the successes that we've had in service delivery, particularly our program of rolling out housing, 3.3 million free and subsidized houses have been built. I think that's a success that any society and any government can be justly proud of. The fact of the matter is that many, if not the majority of those houses, have been built on the peripheries of our cities, reinforcing those apartheid spatial patterns. Things that then bedevil our ability in many instances to deliver services, because we are stretching our transport lines, our logistics lines, the infrastructure that is needed to bring water, sanitation and electricity to people. And it's also taking people further away from jobs and access to social and economic opportunities. But I think also we forget, and I think it's been pointed out, that the system of local government that we have today is not even as old as our democracy. It's a system that's 13 years old. 13 years ago, we had a hodgepodge of 800 municipalities of different types, shapes and sizes. There were areas of our country that simply didn't even fall within the jurisdiction of a municipality. Today, 13 years later, we have a system of 280 odd municipalities that cover every square kilometer of South Africa and puts it within the jurisdiction of a municipality. We have, I think, a fundamentally sound constitutional and legal framework for the operation of local government. And I think it's a framework that's admired throughout the world, and particularly on our continent. The fact of the matter is it's not going to be easy to construct that system into the vision that the Constitution has for what local government should be. That's going to be work that is going to engage us as government and as society, I think, for many generations to come. The general. On the other hand, I think we missed out on the specificity of many of these problems. We tend to talk in generalizations. Government is corrupt from top to bottom, from the mayor's house to the president's house, etc., etc. Now, I mean, clearly, I think one only has to pause for a moment and to, with a naked eye even, look at where we've come as a society to realize that that can't be true. Local government can't be one big unmitigated disaster zone. Local government can't be all corrupt. Local government can't be all incompetent. It's simply not true. South Africa is not all on fire. It's not true. And if we depart from that premise, we're not going to arrive at solutions. We need to start being specific. To say the problems lie in these, and these provinces, in these, and these municipalities, and the problems are X, Y, and Z. They might relate to broader systemic issues, but those problems manifest themselves in very specific ways, in very specific localities. And if one analyzes what is generally referred to as service delivery protests, one quickly comes to realize that in fact it's a very deceptive and I think a very unuseful terminology. Because indeed, service delivery is a dimension to many of the protests. But once you go in, and I think the paper referred to by, that was written by Lerumo Tauyatwala, I think analyzes that in a very sophisticated and nuanced way. I don't necessarily agree with all aspects of that analysis, or maybe the way it's been summarized there. I think the full analysis gives a much more nuanced perspective to say that these protests are taking place against the backdrop of massive poverty, inequality, and unemployment. They're taking place against the backdrop of service delivery that is taking place. Maybe not fast enough, and definitely not in all areas. But many of the protests arise out of a complex interplay of factors within specific communities. And I think if we don't take the time and the trouble to do that analysis, we're going to come to wrong conclusions and hence in many cases to wrong prescriptions. I'm timing myself. So remember, I was the deputy chief at one stage and I was an assistant speaker, so I know the issue of speaking time very well. Let me then race forward. I think there are some big issue questions that confront us as a society. I think one of them are demographic issues. We have a massive trend towards urbanization. That's something that actually is not a bad thing. However, if we don't manage it properly, it can become a liability. And the reality is that for many of our municipalities, managing urbanization is a huge challenge. Second is, we have persistent levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Those things impact on local government and service delivery. In many municipalities, you'll find levels of service delivery. But one can also ask the question, what is the use of basic service delivery to people, to a community where there's an unemployment rate of 60%? I'm not saying service delivery is useless, but it doesn't address many other fundamental questions that community would face. And that's not the responsibility of local government alone. It's a national issue that we need to deal with. No. Unless you're prepared to grant me injury time. I would have wanted to talk about governance, risks, capacity challenges, intergovernmental relations, the regulations and the legislation that COGTA has put in place, and also broader issues of governance, and particularly public participation. But that will, I'm sure, be left for a roundtable. Thank you.
You can take a few more minutes. Everybody will be
You're not going to be accused of being executive-minded and.
I might.
Yeah. I think just very quickly. I think that having said all of those, I think there are very serious challenges. I mean, in government generally, and in local government in particular. And I think Salva has spoken to those. From the point of view of COGTA, we've amended legislation in the form of the Municipal Systems Act. That legislation deals with certain of the aspects of cadre deployment, quote unquote, that Professor Habib referred to. Those regulations are setting minimum standards, experience requirements for senior municipal managers. It's putting in place very definite systems through which people get employed in local government. It's making provision for people who are found guilty of corruption, of fraud, of other transgressions of the law, to not only be fired, but to be kept out of local government for periods of up to 10 years. And requiring that their names be put on databases that need to be consulted before they're employed, so that they can't be fired in one municipality, skip and go and be employed by another. We've recently also put ceilings on the remuneration for municipal managers, wide uniformity. I think there's a lot of good legislative and policy work that's being done. The challenge will remain to ensure that those things are effectively and properly implemented. But I think just a challenge, seeing that I am at the School of Governance. Have our tertiary institutions also undergone the necessary transformation of mindset and of curricula? Are we training architects, town planners, engineers in ways that make them understand these challenges and equip them to find solutions to these challenges? Two, one of the big challenges that we have, our constitution and our legislation has set in place probably one of the most participative and open approaches to governance, especially at a local government level. The problem is the gap between what the constitution and the law says and what happens in practice. You can have an IDP meeting, a ward committee meeting. You can assemble people. You can talk to them. And then you can tick the box and say we've consulted the people. Is that meaningful public participation in planning processes? That requires capacity both on the part of local government to consult meaningfully and to take people's views into account meaningfully, to incorporate those views into planning processes. In many cases, municipalities don't have that. They outsource those processes to consultants. On the other hand, are communities properly equipped to make use of the opportunities that those structures and processes present? I think the School of Governance can assist in both of those levels. Thanks.